They called it a routine exit interview. Bob shook a few hands, turned in his badge, and walked out the front door of the company he'd given 3 years of his life to. No dramatic speech. No slammed doors. No threats. Just a quiet nod, and the soft click of the latch behind him. Management watched him go with barely disguised relief. The difficult employee was gone. The guy who kept asking about raises, about overtime, about fairness, gone. They could finally move on. They had no idea. Because Bob didn't leave with a grudge. He didn't leave with stolen files, deleted databases, or sabotaged servers. He left with something far more dangerous. He left with knowledge. And 1 week later, every single non-managerial employee in that company opened their inbox to find a very politely worded email, and a spreadsheet, that would bring the entire organization to its knees. This is that story. To understand what Bob did, you have to understand who Bob was. He grew up in a quiet Ontario subdivision, the kind of neighborhood where the big excitement was road hockey on cracked asphalt and whose parents were going to upgrade the family car first. Other kids counted the hours until they could get outside. Bob counted the hours until he could get back inside. Because inside, on the kitchen table, sat the family's old beige desktop computer. Cracked open like a patient on an operating table, its guts exposed, its mysteries waiting. He was 8 years old the first time he took one apart. He wasn't being destructive. He was being curious. There was something about the logic of a machine that spoke to him in a way people never quite did. If something didn't work, there was a reason. Always. You just had to be methodical enough to find it. Machines didn't lie. Machines didn't have moods. Machines made sense. By the time he hit high school, Bob was fixing his teachers' laptops for pocket money, and doing a better job than the IT vendor the school board paid. By college, he was building out server infrastructure for small local businesses on weekends. And by his mid-30s, he had become that rare and undervalued creature that every mid-sized company eventually desperately needs but almost never properly understands. The IT guy who keeps everything from falling apart. Not the flashy kind. Not the kind who gives TED Talks about digital transformation or gets profiled in trade magazines. The quiet kind. The good kind. The kind who shows up early, stays late, and somehow keeps 3 incompatible systems talking to each other through what can only be described as technical willpower and the occasional creative prayer. Like most skilled IT professionals, Bob moved around. Better pay here, better challenges there, new systems to learn and master. He wasn't a job hopper. He was a professional. And professionals follow opportunity. 3 years before everything blew up, opportunity led him to a service and distribution company in Ontario. Not glamorous work, they shipped industrial parts, managed vendor relationships, ran payroll, tracked inventory. The kind of business that doesn't make headlines but absolutely makes the economy function. The kind of company that you never think about until everything stops working, and then suddenly it's all you can think about. The IT department, when Bob arrived, consisted of exactly 2 people. Him. And a technician named Darren. That was fine. For a while. Here's something most people don't realize about medium-sized companies. They grow faster than their systems do. By the time this particular company decided to modernize, they were running their operation on a patchwork of software that had been bolted together over decades like some kind of digital Frankenstein's monster. Dispatching ran on one program. Inventory ran on a completely different one. Payroll and finance. A third system entirely. And none of them, talked to each other in any meaningful way. If someone in sales wanted to check inventory levels, they literally had to pick up the phone and call the warehouse. If finance needed to confirm a purchase order, they had to manually cross-reference spreadsheets. Physical ones. Printed out. It was, to use the technical term, a mess. Senior management eventually decided enough was enough. They wanted an ERP, an enterprise resource planning system. For those unfamiliar, an ERP isn't just software. It's the nervous system of an entire company. A single, integrated platform that handles purchase orders, sales orders, inventory, vendor relationships, customer data, payroll, personnel records, shipping logistics, financial reporting, everything, all talking to each other in real time, all in one place. It's also, for the right person, something far more interesting than it sounds. Because an ERP doesn't just run a company. It watches it. Every transaction. Every login. Every report. Every order processed and every hour worked. It's all in there, time-stamped, organized, and queryable. The right query, run by the right person, can tell you things about a company that its own executives don't know. Management put out a call for recommendations. Bob's ears perked up immediately. Because Bob had worked extensively with one particular ERP system at a previous employer. He didn't just know how to use it, he knew it at the architectural level. The database structure. The permission hierarchies. The reporting modules. The bugs. The undocumented workarounds that the vendor didn't even publish. He knew it the way a master watchmaker knows a specific movement, intimately, completely, and with a quiet appreciation for its elegant complexity. He pitched it confidently. Management approved it. That decision, made in a boardroom over mediocre coffee, would change everything. Here's the thing about ERP implementations that software vendors never put in the brochure: they are absolutely brutal. You're not just installing software. You're rebuilding how an entire organization thinks about itself. You're migrating years, sometimes decades, of messy, inconsistent, siloed data into a new unified system. You're retraining hundreds of employees who have built their entire professional muscle memory around the old way of doing things. And you're doing all of this while the business still needs to function, orders still need shipping, invoices still need sending, payroll still needs processing. It's like replacing the engine of a car while the car is still moving. Data migration alone took months. Old records had to be audited, cleaned, reformatted, validated, and imported. Every department had its own, unique, approach to data entry. Which is a polite way of saying everyone had been making things up differently for years. Every manager believed their specific workflow was sacred and shouldn't have to change to accommodate any new system. Bob worked 12-hour days. Regularly. He trained the receiving team on how to properly log incoming shipments so inventory would update in real time. He trained sales on generating quotes and converting them into purchase orders. He trained finance on the reporting modules. He trained HR on personnel tracking. He ran troubleshooting sessions. He responded to panicked emails. He talked people off ledges, figuratively, when they thought they'd broken something that took months to configure. Darren helped where he could. Hardware tickets, printer failures, network issues, Darren had that covered. But the ERP? That was Bob's domain. Entirely. Then, after months of grinding, something remarkable happened. It worked. Tickets slowed down. Reports ran clean. Departments stopped fighting the system and started using it. For the first time, a manager in finance could see what was happening in the warehouse without making a phone call. A sales rep could check real-time inventory before promising a delivery date to a customer. The company felt, for the first time in years, like a coherent organization instead of a collection of departments that happened to share a parking lot. Bob allowed himself, briefly, to exhale. He shouldn't have. Flush with confidence, management made their next move. They decided to expand. Ontario was no longer enough. They wanted Atlantic Canada. They wanted Western Canada. Coast to coast. A bold vision. An exciting growth story. What they didn't fully think through was what it would do to the people who kept the lights on. Atlantic Canada runs 90 minutes ahead of Ontario. A customer sending an order at 8 in the morning their time is sending it at 6:30 Ontario time. British Columbia runs 3 hours behind. An email sent at 3 in the afternoon from Vancouver lands in the Ontario inbox at 6 in the evening. Suddenly, the business day stretched from before sunrise to after dinner. Staff started coming in earlier, staying later. The pressure was constant, because someone, somewhere in the country, always needed something. And every problem, regardless of the hour, regardless of the time zone, regardless of whether Bob was eating breakfast or watching television, was somehow IT's problem. Bob arrived each morning at 8 o'clock. His contract said 8 o'clock. And each morning he walked in to find a backlog of support tickets that had been submitted at 6:45, 7, 7:15. People would approach him the moment he set his bag down. "I emailed you at 7. My shift starts at 8. They didn't care. They never cared. Because when your system isn't working and you need to process orders for customers 3 time zones away, the technicality of someone's shift schedule feels irrelevant. And then at 6:15 in the evening, while Bob was at home trying to eat dinner, his phone would ring. Private number. Work problem. Urgent. Always urgent. He'd stare at the caller ID while his food went cold. Management had what they believed was an elegant solution. Staggered shifts. Bob would start at 6 in the morning. Darren would work until 7 in the evening. Full coast-to-coast coverage. Problem solved. On paper, sure. In reality, Darren had 2 young kids and a wife who worked early mornings. The new shift would detonate their childcare arrangement. He told management this clearly. They told him it was the business need. Darren quit within the week. And with one resignation, Bob went from being half of a 2-person IT department to being the entire IT department of an expanding, multi-time zone company running a complex enterprise system that he himself had built from the ground up. Management posted the job. Then they did what companies in this situation always do, they posted it at a salary significantly below market rate, because budgets, and because surely someone out there would take it. They were wrong. Qualified applicants were scarce. Applicants who knew the specific ERP system were essentially non-existent. Bob watched the job posting sit there, week after week, refreshed and reposted, attracting nobody useful. He knew they wouldn't fill it. He also knew what that meant for him. Bob was not an impulsive person. He was methodical. Analytical. He thought before he acted. And what he thought, after Darren left and the job posting went nowhere, was that it was time to have a direct, professional conversation. He requested a meeting with management. He laid it out clearly, he was now the sole IT resource for the entire company. He was the only person who understood the ERP at the level required to maintain it. He was supporting multiple time zones, training new hires, managing hardware, networking, security, reporting, all of it. He was performing what was objectively a senior specialist role, solo, under conditions that had changed significantly since he was hired. He asked for a raise. They said no. He asked about overtime compensation for the extra hours he was putting in. They told him, with what must have been a straight face, that under Ontario labor law, certain IT professionals are classified as exempt from overtime protections. Bob went home and looked it up. They were correct. Legally. Technically. In the most narrow, precise, letter of the law interpretation possible, they were right. So he did the only thing a methodical, analytical person could do. He kept showing up. He kept doing the work. He kept answering calls at dinner time and clearing ticket backlogs before his shift officially started. And he started paying very close attention to the system. Here is what Bob knew that management had completely failed to consider. The ERP didn't just process business data. It logged everything. Every time a user logged into the system, the timestamp was recorded. Every time they logged out, recorded. If they walked away from their desk and forgot to log out, the system auto-logged them after 15 minutes of inactivity, and recorded that too. Which meant sitting quietly inside the company's own database, organized and time-stamped and completely verifiable, were the actual working hours of every single employee in the company. Not the hours they were scheduled. Not the hours they reported. The hours the machine had recorded them being present and active in the system. Every early login from an Atlantic Canada-facing employee who came in before dawn to manage the time difference. Every late session from someone staying after hours to handle a West Coast customer. Every weekend check-in that nobody ever officially acknowledged. All of it. Right there. In the database. And here's the piece management had overlooked, the piece that would cost them dearly. Under Ontario labor law, salaried employees are still entitled to overtime pay once they exceed 44 hours in a work week. The exemption doesn't apply to everyone. It applies to managers and supervisors. Not to sales reps, not to warehouse coordinators. Not to admin staff. Not to the dozens of people who'd been quietly, consistently working 50, 55, 60-hour weeks since the expansion, uncompensated. Because that's just what you did at a company that was growing fast and didn't think much about the people doing the growing. Bob started pulling reports. Not loudly. Not conspicuously. He had legitimate system access, he'd built the system. He ran the queries one employee at a time, filtered out anyone in a managerial role, and calculated weekly hour totals going back to the ERP's launch date. The numbers were staggering. Dozens of employees. Consistently, systematically over 44 hours a week. For years. Completely underpaid, and with a system that could prove it down to the minute. He exported everything into organized, clearly formatted Excel spreadsheets. Personalized ones. One for each affected employee, showing their own login data, their own weekly totals, their own unpaid overtime. Then he did something careful and entirely legal. He contacted an employment lawyer. Not to file a complaint. Not yet. Just to ask a question. If employees have documented system login records showing consistent hours over 44 per week, are they entitled to overtime pay? The lawyer reviewed the sample data. Yes. Bob asked one more question. Can I legally pass your contact information to those employees? Yes. Bob had already been quietly exploring his options. It wasn't hard. His skill set, deep expertise with a specific enterprise ERP system, was exactly what other companies were looking for. Companies that knew what that was worth. Companies that paid market rate. He found one. He accepted the offer. He gave notice. Management barely reacted. They'd been managing without adequate support for months. They'd convinced themselves it was sustainable. That they'd figure it out. They always figured it out. Bob spent his final days tying up loose ends, writing documentation that nobody would properly read, and handing over credentials he'd spent 3 years accumulating. On his last day, they walked him to the door. Politely. Professionally. They genuinely believed the problem had just walked out with him. 1 week later. A Monday morning. People filing in, coffee in hand, powering up their computers, opening their inboxes. And there it was. Every non-managerial employee in the company, across every department, in every location, sales reps, warehouse staff, admin coordinators, shipping personnel, received an email. The subject line was 6 words. You're legally entitled to overtime pay. The body of the email was brief and precise. It explained that their ERP login records showed consistent hours in excess of 44 per week. It explained their rights under Ontario labor law. It attached a personalized Excel spreadsheet, their own data, their own hours, their own numbers. And it provided a name. A lawyer who was ready to talk. No drama. No accusations. No inflammatory language. Just data, and a door. Management's first response was dismissal. This was nonsense. Scare tactics. Ex-employee bitterness. Then employees started comparing their spreadsheets. And then something interesting happened, people started believing them. Because the data wasn't coming from Bob. It was coming from their own system. Timestamps the company's own software had generated. Login records the company's own database had stored. Numbers that no reasonable person could dismiss as fabricated. 50 hours a week. 55. 58. For 2 years. For 3 years. For people who had no idea they were owed anything because nobody had ever told them. Authorization forms started flowing to the lawyer's office. 1 employee. 5. A dozen. Almost everyone. The ERP data was time-stamped, system-generated, internally consistent, and completely immune to any claim of exaggeration. This wasn't he said she said. It was a database record. The company's own record. Filed away in the system they'd paid to have installed, by the man they'd refused to pay fairly. Negotiations began. Then settlement discussions. The numbers climbed. Years of unpaid overtime, multiplied across dozens of employees, calculated at the rates required by law, with interest. It wasn't a difficult legal case. There was almost nothing to argue. The evidence was airtight because it had been generated automatically, passively, by a machine that had no incentive to lie. The settlement was, by any measure, catastrophic. Let's be clear about what Bob actually did here. He did not delete a single file. He did not corrupt any data. He did not sabotage the system he'd spent months building and years maintaining. He didn't threaten anyone. Didn't blackmail anyone. Didn't do anything that could remotely be described as wrongdoing. He ran reports. He contacted a lawyer. He forwarded information to people who had a legal right to it. Everything he did was entirely, completely, unambiguously legal. What makes this story extraordinary is not the revenge. It's the precision. Bob didn't get angry. He got analytical. He identified a structural problem, a company systematically underpaying its workforce, and he used the only tool available to him, the system he understood better than anyone. The ERP they'd installed to optimize efficiency became the instrument that forced accountability. The company had invested heavily in a system designed to centralize information and eliminate blind spots. They'd just never considered that one of those blind spots might be themselves. All of this. Every dollar of that settlement, every hour of legal negotiation, every moment of organizational chaos, could have been avoided. A raise. Maybe some genuine acknowledgement of what Bob was carrying. Perhaps a serious attempt to hire proper support at a market rate that could actually attract qualified candidates. Instead, they tried to squeeze maximum value out of a specialist while giving him minimum compensation, assuming he would absorb it silently because that's what people do. That's what people always do. Bob was not most people. Somewhere in Ontario, at a company that understood what his expertise was worth and paid accordingly, Bob logged in at 8 o'clock in the morning. He worked his shift. He logged out. He left his phone on silent during dinner. The machines still made sense. They always had. People, he'd learned, the people who run companies and make decisions and assume that loyalty is a one-way street until suddenly it isn't. People were a different calculation entirely. But even they, it turned out, were just systems. And if you knew the right queries to run, they were just as readable as any database. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been undervalued, overworked, or watched a company assume that specialists will simply absorb whatever pressure you put on them, let us know in the comments. And if you know someone in IT who deserves to hear this one, share it with them. They'll understand exactly what Bob understood. The data always tells the truth.